For a heavily traumatized person, being in the body is not the place to be. And if we go too quickly into embodiment processes, then they're going to fragment. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not like, okay, if a person becomes embodied, this is going to be good. For really traumatized people, if you get into your body too quickly, the salience network is just going to blast and they'll go into a deeply dysregulated state. But if you have good containment, good therapy, then we can go in frame by frame and slow things down and kind of dilate time a little bit so that then that person can go through the discharge process that didn't happen after the trauma in the first place. So it's stuck in time. We're just releasing it.
Hey listeners, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we have Dr. Brian Tierney, a licensed psychologist specializing in somatic approaches to trauma resolution. He integrates diverse disciplines such as somatic psychology, neurobiology, and general systems theory to foster resilience and healing. As a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, Dr. Tierney educates students in clinical neuroscience, psychological assessment, and psychopharmacology. He has a book coming out. We don't know when, but it will be out soon, called Visionary Somatics, which introduces an innovative paradigm for trauma healing and bridging the gap between ancient practices and modern psychotherapy. I pulled that right from ChatGPT. So, Brian, it's great to have you here.
Good to be on the GPT, AI is just propagating everywhere. So, it's like, here we go. We're being catapulted into the unknown with the AI.
We are, yeah. And I think there's some interesting overlap there between the emergence of neurosciences as a core study over the last 20, 25 years, because the brain, the mind, if you will, has continued to be this sort of territory that we've explored, but we never fully know. And I think your work on neuroscience, but not just purely a sort of intellectual-based neuroscience, but really something that's more grounded in somatic practice, offers an integrative approach that you don't hear a lot about in neuroscience necessarily. Neuroscience tends to be a very sort of heady, intellectual, neck above process for a lot of folks.
Yeah, there's really been this paradigm shift into the network neuroscience paradigm over the last, about 20 years with Rakel's discovery of the default mode network, which has really taken off in the psychedelic discourse. It's really taken center stage, I think, in terms of the framing, the kind of hypothetical or theoretical framing of what's happening in the brain during psychedelic experience. But it's really, that was just really the beginning of a paradigm shift. And, it's still in its infancy, this network neuroscience paradigm. And my book is a lot about hashing out the developments over the last 20 years, which there's this thing called theory lag, right? Where you get a new theory like polyvagal theory, which Stephen Porges just basically birthed as a dissertation in the freaking 80s. And it's only becoming popular today. So it's like sometimes theory lag is like 30, 40 years.
Network neuroscience. It's the first time I've heard that phrase, and I've talked to quite a few neuroscientists. Can you provide a little bit more context there in terms of like what is network neuroscience? What does that mean?
Yeah, so the default mode network that's a network, and so what is the brain is thought of as a distributed network that's made up of sub networks, and the default mode network is a major network within this sort of mega network that is the brain. So what are we thinking in terms of a network? Well, we're talking millions, gazillions of neurons that cluster together to do to perform functions. And so like the default mode network, it essentially looks like, if you look at it in a white matter imaging system, fMRI, it looks a bit like a mohawk. And so it is a network of many, many neurons that perform this function. In the case of the default mode network, what are the functions? Mental time travel. So like projecting into the future or traveling back into the past. When I tell you to think about a moment when you're 5, that default mode network, the front of it is lighting up like crazy. So mental time travel, self-regulation, autobiographical memory. So like narrativization, the stories that we tell ourselves. And essentially the default mode network is often thought of as like our best contender in modern neuroscience for the ego, the structural correlate, functional structural correlate in the brain to what has been called the ego for quite some time now.
Yeah, the default mode network was really popularized by Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, based off the work of Robin Carhart Harris, who is one of the world's premier neuroscientists. And so he's done a lot of research specifically with fMRI scans on how psychedelics interrupt that default mode network. But more and more, as I've been talking to certain either neuroscientists or medical doctors that have a focus on brain health, there's been talk of the Salience network is another network that's generated more popularity. What could you give us sort of an overview of in-network neuroscience? What are some of the other sort of prominent or often talked about networks that come into dialogue and conversation?
Yes, so triune theories of the brain have been in vogue for quite some time. Like, for example, with Paul MacLean, when you hear that reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and people still vibe with that model. I still teach couples basically, and they like to hear and they make sense of like this image of a reptile brain. It just makes sense to people when it's not really that true. I mean, our brain is human, and it's human all throughout. But all that to say that, having a threefold functional structural map of the brain is, it's been around for quite some time. And so the triple network theory includes the default mode network, the salience network, which you mentioned, and we'll talk about the salience network, and then the next one, which is called the task positive network. Okay, so what we have really is a kind of update in an interesting way to the Paul MacLean triune brain model, where you have the reptile brain that does basic function, fight, flight, freeze stuff. And then the mammalian brain that's a lot about attachment bonding and the attachment relationship and, a little bit more complex emotions and so on. And then the neocortex, which is higher order narrativization, making meaning and stuff like that. With this network neuroscience update, you have this threefold model where you have the default mode network, which is on the top, essentially, because it's higher order processing, our meaning-making process, like what we could call our kind of default hallucination about what reality means and what's happening in reality. And then the salience network is really about kind of like how we direct our attention. Okay. So, like for example, as a somatic person, the insula, which is one of the major hubs for the salience network, the insula region of the brain. So it's like this, if you think about the core tube, like the brain and the nervous system is like tubes within tubes. And the outer layer is kind of this bulging out of the neocortex. But as you get closer in, you get this kind of sleeve around the primitive portion, like the midbrain and stuff like that. And that sleeve is the insula. And the insula lights up like a Christmas tree when, for example, I were saying to you, hey, why don't you direct your attention to that region of your chest, see if you can feel your heartbeat. And the insula, and that's when you're directing your attention inward. It's called interoception, right? You're tracking inner sensation. Insula lights up like crazy. You're directing that attention. That's the salience network down into the body. But you could also be directing your attention towards something that's happening out there socially. So somebody sneezes or something like that. And you direct your attention outwards and you make all sorts of meaning or something like that. That's also the salience network because that sneeze is salient. That's what salience means. It's something that happens in the environment that gets your attention either on the outside or on the inside. Okay. The third one is the task network. Okay. The task positive network. So this lights up. We're on task right now, you and I. We're talking. And we're in the task network by nature of being on task. And, whatever it is, meditation is a task. attending to our to-do lists. Those are tasks. And essentially we have a reciprocal tension or a paired opposition between the task network and the default mode network. So when the default mode network goes up, we're kind of daydreaming and making meaning and going into the past and comparing with the future and so on. And the task network generally goes down, but when we're on task and we're doing stuff, that often we're not daydreaming as much. So the default mode network tends to go down as the task network goes up. So with trauma, though, the wires get crossed with all three of these networks, and they just kind of lose communication. So the default mode network starts to intrude on things, intrude on task. We're on task right now. If we were really traumatized, then there could be material intruding upon our task moment right now, like either internal from the salience network, body sensations, or memories and images from the past that are coming through the default mode network in the core of the brain. So that's a long-winded way of just kind of hashing out this tripartite model, but there's many networks in the brain. Like in my book, I talk about like there's like 12 to 17 networks that have been mapped.
Wow.
Not just 3. I mean, it's easy as a teaching paradigm to narrow it down to 3, but it's much more complex than that.
And so what is the role of soma then and somatics in this? Because when I think of soma or somatics, I often don't think of the brain and these neural networks or neuroscience, these network neurosciences. I think of the body and what's sort of actively lived through the body. And so as you've sort of navigated this work over the years, where have you found there to be that direct connection and relationship between these networks in the brain and the actual lived experience of being in a human body?
Yeah, well, the nervous system is interwoven with all the other systems. I mean, you have a lot of knowledge about inflammation, I gather. And of course, inflammation teaches us and shows us that the nervous system is deeply interwoven with the immune system, which is deeply interwoven with the cardiovascular system, which is deeply interwoven with the connective tissue system. The last one is particularly important for the embodiment process, okay, the connective tissue system. So you have all these stretch receptors when we're moving and doing yoga or something, or lifting weights or running, or being touched or touching. That information, it needs to be processed. And so that information does get processed, and we have so many, in fact, the fascia, the connective tissue of the body, is essentially the richest sensory organ in the body as a whole, right? So it's like we're constantly getting visual information, auditory information, but the fascia and the connective tissue gets neglected as a major input of information because we're constantly needing to track where the body is in gravity. You know what I mean? And also where the rubber hits the road in terms of clinical practice with connective tissue is what we call character armoring. Okay, so which would be a postural problem where you have a trauma of some kind. The body gets into a defense gesture. Like the most classic one, of course, is a fetal position. Something bad happens. We go into a fetal position, like a shame response, fetal position, and we don't clear it. So the nervous system and the postural system just starts to practice a gesture of defense on a subtle level over years, okay? And then it basically feeds its way into the brain and into that person's character. So Wilhelm Reich, the founder of Western somatic psychotherapy, called that character armoring. Right? So this is a deep relationship between soma, what's happening in the body, and psyche, what's happening in our meaning-making processes. And, as a somatic person, we're trained, and our kind of bread and butter is to be able to look at a body and read how that body holds stress. What are the stress patterns and how this body holds, trauma and holds its history in the tissue. The issues are in the tissues, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting. I started doing a very intense form of body work. I've talked about this on the podcast before, so it won't come as a surprise to all of the listeners, but this type of body work included rectal ketamine. And it was with it was with a gentleman who is quite well known. He's in Gualala. I won't mention who it is. He's asked me not to mention explicitly who he is, but he's done this for 50 years. And I remember the feeling after coming out of that experience, which I've done massages and I'd even done some Rolfing leading up to this session, but I'd never done a ketamine assisted deep sort of fascia tissue release. And I remember coming out of a 2-hour session feeling like I had just gone through a week of plant medicine. And since then, body work has been, at this point in time, I actually have a 8-hour session tomorrow. And I work with a body worker out of Southern California who does 8-hour full body sessions. It's quite intense, but I'm into it. And yet, even after all of this body work that I've done, what I've noticed is I still hold a lot of tension in my upper traps, kind of like back upper traps. And I was at an event a couple weeks ago, and this guy came over to me. He's a chiropractor and facilitator coach. And he guided me through this sort of inner child process when I went back to being a 5-year-old. And there was some aspects about unworthiness and not feeling like I had to perform to receive love. Guided me deep into my subconscious, did some chiropractor stuff right after that, found this tension, and for the first time in recent memory, it didn't hurt when I started to massage it and touch it. Like there was some sort of release there that I hadn't found through just direct body work, but something about going into the psyche, going into the inner child, doing this sort of work allowed for a release of that. And so it's just the most interesting reflection that I have, because I think a lot of it, speaking to this point about character armoring, is, there's armor that I've been holding in the upper back, and I've always had a challenging time with, okay, how do I actually release this? Because I can have a hot pad on it, I can get massages on it all the time, but nothing was actually getting to the core of what it was.
Interesting. There's this guy called Arnie Mindell. He's a Jungian theorist, and he's a genius. And he has this term called the dream body, which I think is a really interesting idea, because when you look at the default mode network, that's actually what we encounter in terms of function. So like when we're sleeping, the default mode network lights up like a Christmas tree, but it also lights up when the task network goes down and we're kind of daydreaming and making meaning. And our kind of default opinions and our default identity, all that stuff is default mode stuff. So collectively, though, or another way of talking about the default mode network is like it really is kind of like our hallucination. It is like our waking dream. It lights up while we're actually dreaming, but it's also our waking dream. So Mindell was onto something when he was talking about body work. Because the deepest layer of the psyche is like a dreaming layer where everything starts to interpenetrate, where our life, it's weird, right? It's both kind of non-linear and chaotic, but also really precise. That's a paradox to hold. You can get in there with the body. And for example, sometimes I'll do free association work with people, where I'm touching their body, and let's say I'm doing Rolfing, because I'm a Rolfing practitioner, structural integration practitioner. I'm deep in there with the connected tissue, plowing things out, and I get them to just spontaneously produce an image when we get into a tension point. I just say, hey, just, let your mind go free, let your mind wander, and just let it produce the first memory or image that comes to mind. Doesn't need to make sense, you don't need to do anything with it, you don't need to filter it through your filters about what should be logical and what shouldn't be logical and all that stuff. Just give me the first thing that comes to mind. And it's interesting how weirdly random and precise the dream body can be at the same time. It's a paradoxical idea.
Yeah, and I have this in my notes that archetypes, mythology, non-ordinary states, we often think of these as, I guess, of the mind, but in many ways they play out in somatic frameworks as well. And so I'm curious for you to maybe deepen into this a little bit in terms of what role do dreams and archetypes and mythology in these non-ordinary states, including with psychedelics, what role do they play in better understanding our soma, the body that we exist within, and how do we integrate these without slipping into spiritual bypassing? Because I know there are a lot of spiritual people who get caught up in the archetypes, they get caught up in the dreams, they get caught up in the mythology, but it never actually becomes integrated into the soma and the experience of their reality.
Yeah, it's a great question. In terms of archetypal theory, and I love archetypal theory, I think it's great, but it's also any theory and any practice, I think at least from the Jungian perspective, has a tendency to tip into shadow. And that includes psychedelics and everything else, right? So what I think is at play in healing practices in terms of an archetype, the core archetype of healing is what we could call the death and rebirth, the archetype of death and rebirth. And this is in the literature, it shows up in mythology, it shows up in trip logs, it shows up, and there's a lot of evidence that ketamine trip logs converge a great deal with near-death experiences. I mean, this is a long tradition in psychedelics that psychedelic process and psychotic process converge. And really what you have is this strange death and rebirth archetype that keeps on showing up in different ways in different languages and they're clothed in different images. But I think if we were to think about an archetype of healing, it would almost have to include this death and rebirth image. And that's the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? It can be gnarly in there. If you're dying, and that's often the case in like a bad trip, right? The sense of being in the belly of the whale and the acid bath. The acid bath is an ancient image for the death portion of the death and rebirth. This comes from alchemy. Like where you see these weird images of people in an acid bath, like getting corroded and broken down. It's kind of one of the experiences, right? When you're in the belly of the whale of a psychedelic molecule, you're just like in the acid bath, right? And you're dying. Right. Then there's the rebirth on the other side. And it doesn't have to be psychedelics, right? I mean, like intense breathing exercises and things like that. They're plugging into similar process archetypes. Process archetype of death and rebirth.
And a lot of the death and rebirth is, all of really the death and rebirth, unless you're Lazarus, is it's of the psyche, right? It's of the mind. Indigenous cultures and ancient cultures have and some continue to use rites of passage for that ego death because it allows the rebirth, the full maturation of the human. It's not necessarily, it really can't be a death and rebirth of the soma unless we're talking about reincarnation, where the actual physical body of what we have really does die. And yet I'm sort of touching into a paradox because when people go through these death and rebirth experiences, it can change the way that they relate to their body in a substantial and significant way. So I think my question would be, for these death and rebirth experiences, how can that transformation actually be integrated into the soma, and it's not just a story that's sort of playing out in the mind of whoever's going through it?
So as humans, we have a tendency to idealize. And nothing is left out of that. So there can be an idealization of embodiment, like where everything meaningful happens in the body and when we're tracking what's happening in the body, or everything meaningful happens when we're taking a psychedelic, or everything meaningful and important happens when we're in some this or that religious practice, like Christian religious practice, or we'll take this or that sect. So I would just want to put that as a disclaimer. I would want to put that on the table in front of us that, we would want to be cautious about just saying that embodiment is always where it's at and like this is the royal road to meaning making and the royal road to healing. I think the way that I work and the way that I like to teach is I want to nurture our propensity to idealize, because otherwise it's hard to have a mission in life if you don't have ideals to live by and values to live by. But they also fuck us up, our ideals, and they get us lost in spiritual overrides, religious overrides, and paradoxically that can happen in the body too. Like, people that are embodiment junkies, everything meaningful has to be embodied so that there becomes kind of like an anti-intellectualization thing, anti-intellect. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's an art to hold that tension of being realistic about what the limitations are for any way of thinking or being. Embodiment, like, just to give you a concrete example, for a heavily traumatized person, being in the body is not the place to be. And if we go too quickly into embodiment processes, then they're going to fragment. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not like, okay, if a person becomes embodied, this is going to be good. No. For really traumatized people, if you get into your body too quickly, the salience network is just going to blast, and the whole thing is going to get disorganized. And they'll go into a deeply dysregulated state. So body can
Why is that?
Deep in the brain, you have a memory of the trauma that isn't processed. It's stuck in time. It's in a fixed and repeating action pattern. It's like a sequence, a compressed sequence. Let's say we get in a car accident. Bad car accident happens. Time slows down. What happens when time is slowing down? The brain is trying to get as many frames of information as possible. It takes like a zillion snapshots of what's happening so that it can record all that information so that it doesn't happen again, or so that the organism can prevent, death and destruction. And so now, naturally, after trauma happens, what does the organism do? It goes through shaking processes, trembling, crying. You look at other mammals and what happens after a trauma thing where they go into collapsed immobility and the death feigning, and they kind of go into this flop mode. They go into a boot up response once the organism knows that it's safe, and then you see all this weird shit happen, like all this shaking, and it's essentially this deep boot up response. But, as humans, we've been sort of conditioned out of that natural animal response to a trauma. So that trauma, the traumas that let's say it's a car accident, it gets stuck in my nervous system because it hasn't been released, hasn't been discharged. And that just keeps on replaying in like movements and postural patterns and stuff. But in body work or whatever the therapeutic environment, if we're able to open that file folder with all that compressed information from the slowed down time and kind of dilate time a little bit, and what will happen is that the system will flood with all sorts of emotion. Okay. And if it's not therapeutically held, that salience network, you ask like, well, how does that happen? That the salience network, which is like how we direct our attention towards the emotion or towards the memory of what happened frame by frame during the trauma, all that stuff will just flood through the system, and we won't even know where to direct our attention. And not only that, the attentional process itself becomes really disoriented and disorganizing. And so the brain can't organize experience, and what's happening, we're reliving the experience. But if you have good containment, good therapy, then we can kind of go in frame by frame and slow things down and kind of dilate time a little bit, so that then that person can go through the discharge process that didn't happen after the trauma in the first place. So it's stuck in time, and we're just releasing it.
So some things I'm putting together, and the question that I had then for you as a So sort of building on a lot of what we talked about. See, you're a professor at CIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies. They themselves have a psychedelic assisted therapy training program. The perspective that I've heard is that it is, from what I understand, largely theoretical or didactic or academic, and that's, I would say, largely because of the current legal restrictions that exist around psychedelics as prohibited compounds.
Yeah.
And so with your background in somatics, neuroscience, clinical psychology, but also psychedelics, you're familiar with this terrain in many ways. If there were no restrictions given and you could create a training program for practitioners to really help psychedelics be useful adjuncts for therapeutic outcomes, what would be some considerations that you would bring into that program? How might you think about the structure of that program for practitioners? What might be some key takeaways or outcomes that you think would be helpful as a sort of teaching trajectory to facilitate for that?
Well, as a touch therapist with, like 25 years of experience, touch would be part of that program. So grounding, it's like everything has got to start with grounding, in my opinion. Like the capacity to, because we're bioelectric beings, to establish our ground as individuals, as a group, and in the therapeutic environment, that is like step number one. And touch affords us a space of deep relational grounding. So teaching people how to touch and to use touch as a primary resource for grounding and the neurology of touch, this would be like under the wider intention to get really grounded, to turn off those phones, to connect with the breath and the breathing rhythm, and to know about the neurology of the breath. All of that would be a picture of grounding to start off with. Establishing a ground would be primary. It's like safety gets talked about a lot, and obviously I would be talking about safety a lot, but, safety from a bioenergetic perspective has everything to do with grounding. And if we can't establish a ground as a community, as individuals, and as relational beings, then might as well not take the psychedelic if we're going to take one. If there isn't like a collective sense of ground and safety first, like to me, there would have to be an option to like just not partake unless there's a kind of collective field of grounding first. And then I'd like to bring in another paradox, and the other paradox is that that we could find some ground in our imagination together. That imagination is the ground of our being. Now that's paradoxical, right? Because we often think about imagination as being rootless, groundless, like fantasy. But the greatest philosophers actually make radical statements like the imagination is the ground of our being. If you think about it, nothing gets created without imagination, like in humanity. But if we're thinking about panentheism or panentheism, where the whole universe is imbued with meaning making, then, and if we wanted to think about a God figure out there, then everything, every piece of matter gets generated out of the imagination of the deity. It starts it with imagination, and then it, gets manifested over time. So that's a paradox, right? Starting with grounding, and that includes being grounded or getting grounded in the imagination.
I suppose this is partly an individual, but also a collective question. If working with a group of practitioners, or you yourself working as a practitioner, what are we imagining? What is the imaginal realm that we can call in, or that we exist within, that would be conducive to either the therapeutic alliance or an individual or group coming into wholeness? Like, bring us a little bit deeper into what that means to exist in these imaginal realms when it comes to the somatic practice of working with the body and all that.
Well, so I mentioned death and rebirth as an archetype. And I think archetypes, what do? They help us to find shared humanity. Like if we talk about death and rebirth, depending on how you package it and how you clothe the images of death and rebirth, most people can relate to that, right? Like, the born again Christian, you know what I mean? A lot of psychedelic oriented folks can relate to death and rebirth as an image of transformation. So, the way that I teach the archetypes, is neurologically. I teach the archetypes not just as images as pie in the sky, but as deep operating systems in the human, where we can find our humanity together through these archetypal intensities and through archetypal imagery. So like we all got to deal with aggression. We've got to figure out how we can creatively transmute aggression. And for thousands of years, the warrior archetype has been an image of aggression, and whether it's done well or not well, whether it's done in integrity or not integrity, whether a person is capable of being accountable and being disciplined and so on. Because, if you don't have a warrior online, you're just going to succumb to addiction, which is a danger for psychonauts to just get addicted to tripping, to the trip, to the adventure. And if you don't have your warrior fully online, then we're going to topple into that space. So, like these rich images help us to plug into, I like to call them energy reserves, which provide bulwarks because, it's like in the psychedelic experience, it's like the snow globe. I like this image, like the snow globe to the brain and the default mode network, which is like a shaking up. And then we got to be cautious and careful about what structures and what beliefs are structuring in the wake of that unstructured mix-up. So what sorts of meanings are we going to make? Let's be conscious about, the shadows that can reside in the meaning-making processes, like arrogance, grandiosity, all that stuff is really human archetypal stuff. And that arrogance and grandiosity tends to cluster around these archetypal geographies. So learning about the archetypes helps us to be responsible so that we can notice when we're starting to get inflated and grandiose, which that's one of the dangers as well with psychedelics, that we become inflated. And any ideology or process that is deeply concerned with meaning making and meaning production. That the danger of that is toppling into grandiosity, spiritual grandiosity. And so the archetypes helps us to kind of, keep our feet in humanity while we're tripping in the cosmos, which is quite another paradox, right? Keeping our feet grounded deeply in our shared humanity, where we all have a shadow, and we also have our arms and our head branching out into the complexity and the power of the cosmic energies. Another paradox. It can rip us apart.
A question that's coming up for me that comes from the body worker that I've worked with on occasion is he has a quote that he either taught me or is from a German author where he I forget the exact quote, but the important part for this is transformation, not transcendence, that we can go into the body and see transformation through that lens rather than transcending out of it. And so just to set maybe a polarity here, how do you think about those two phrases, transformation and transcendence, when it comes to healing, therapeutic work, psychedelics? How do you think about those
I'm with
two?
this guy. So the deepest philosophers that I'm really into, Gilles Deleuze is the guy that's very much in my book. That I was a Jungian for many, many years, and on some level I still am a Jungian at heart, but I've kind of transitioned into the thinking of Deleuze, who's this just magician. He's a magician. And I go
how do you spell his name, this guy?
Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze. So Capitalism and Schizophrenia is a weird ass book that I think sophisticated psychonauts out there should really explore, because I like to say, it really is like taking a high dose LSD trip without needing a molecule. This is Deleuze's mind. Deleuze's mind brings you into a psychonaut space where you become an astronaut in human concepts. But what's just trippy about Deleuze is that he somehow maintains a groundedness and pragmatism and weaving in the sciences, and the weirdness of Deleuze is like an endless. I can't say enough about how weird and wonderful Deleuze is. So what brought us on the Deleuze track? Can you remind me?
Transformation, not transcendence.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So one of the things that Deleuze just, is constantly challenging is this transcendent function, which Jung was actually about, and this obsession in humanity to achieve a transcendent position. And he is on the hunt constantly about the impulse to achieve transcendence. And as a binary to that, he offers us a philosophy of what's immanent. A philosophy of immanence is what it's called. Philosophy of immanence basically means that we're all in the soup. And there is nothing outside of the fray. There's not a transcendent position to arrive at. I call it arrivalism, where, we get into these fantasies of if we get the right algorithm of growth or we get the right molecule that will be powered into a transcendent position that's beyond our common everyday human suffering and neuroticism. Or if we find the right ceremonial leader, if we find the right luminary or the right diet or the right dopamine program or something like that, then we'll achieve a transcendent position. And, Deleuze attacks pretty much all transcendent thinking. He basically saying that is the kind of the bane of our existence, transcendent thinking. And not only the bane of our existence, but ubiquitous. Like transcendent thinking is everywhere.
Does this relate at all to, do you think transcendence relates at all to the sort of ubiquitous desire to numb? Is there a relationship between transcendence and numbing?
I think so. I think because if numbing and dissociation, they have a kind of, they're in the same neighborhood. Numbing and dissociation, right? There's a distancing dynamic. Distancing to what? Well, one thing that we distance is like the intensity of real human contact. We distance ourselves from that all the time. And then we go to our opinions and we go to our beliefs and we try to enroll each other in different belief systems and different opinions and stuff like that. What are we avoiding? Contact, real contact, naked contact, like the intensity of just being in front of being with another human being. So dissociation and numbing is a way of kind of providing a buffer from the intensities of being that are immanent in being itself. Immanent, right? And what else is immanent? Gnarly shit is immanent. Hatred is immanent. The stuff that we try to transcend ourselves out of, all that, envy, hatred, greed, the desire to be at the top of the hierarchical ladder of some kind, whether it's a spiritual hierarchy or a technocratic hierarchy, all that stuff's in the shadow of immanence, but also the glory of supernovas coming into being and the glory of a new species being born and the glory of, just the glorious wonder of it all.
Immanence.
Immanence.
It reminds me, I'm reading a book called Immanence that's about aliens and how they might actually be real, and sort of the presence of aliens is imminent in our lives and society. Real contact. I mean, it's funny that you even mentioned contact, right? Because this sense of, are we coming into contact with something extraterrestrial, something that is non-human, something that is outside of ourselves? And I don't think it's any coincidence that psychedelics are sort of coming back into vogue as a way to maybe prepare us for this imminent contact with an intelligence or a way of being that is so outside the norm of what we are used to,
Well, that's right on. I think, the alien is an archetype. And as an archetype, these archetypes are just going to keep on recurring in different clothes throughout all time. And I think it's important to reflect on aliens. One way of thinking about artificial intelligence is that it's an alien intelligence. right? It is other than us. It is profoundly other, and that's the definition of alien, right? So that's a weird. I haven't thought about it until now. I appreciate the conversation. It's like that's interesting, right? It's like the alien is here. It's like it's happening. I mean, I talked with it this morning.
Yeah, that's a reflection that I had. I had a podcast interview a few months ago with a writer and journalist, David J. Brown, who writes a lot about DMT entities. And we talked a little bit about this, about what does it say about life that we have this interesting convergence of psychedelics, aliens, and AI that seem to all be coming together at the same time. And another friend of mine would say, not only is AI a sort of alien intelligence, but psychedelics in and of themselves are a somewhat alien intelligence. And Terence McKenna once hypothesized that mushrooms arrived here on an asteroid. They didn't come here from Earth. They are from elsewhere. So that capacity, I think, just to bring this back to the transformation versus transcendence, I think the capacity to be in touch, be in contact with these emergent technologies, if you will, and be transformed through them is what is being asked of us. And yet, in that process, to still, what I hear a lot of writers and philosophers talk about is how do we still maintain our beingness in that process, and not, as Aldous Huxley warned us about, not become the machine itself. And I think that's where this practice of the soma is an integral practice to remaining rooted in sort of our sovereignty as a human being.
Nice. Yeah, transform means to change shape. The archetype of the magician for thousands of years has been an expression of shape-shifting, transformation, the capacity to change formation, innovate new forms. That's an interesting another binary that we could, in another show sometime talk about, a binary between tradition and innovation. The great world traditions around psychedelics, and then also the innovative spirit, and what are the new forms that are being created, and like how do we morph together? How do we molt? How do we morph and molt together? And that's I think a weird kind of juxtaposition of tradition and innovation. Is like the traditions can provide us a kind of incubation space to then molt and innovate from that space. I think traditions at their best can do that, but we're in new territory here, right? It's like this has never been seen before where we're at. We're molting right now.
Yes, we are. Well, this was fun. We could continue. I think there's like a whole rabbit hole that I feel like we just opened up, but we'll have to wait for the second part of our conversation to do that. So, Dr. Brian Tierney, it's been an honor. Keep an eye out for Dr. Tierney's new book, Visionary Somatics, which we don't have a publication date yet for, but will be out, we hope, at some point, assuming we don't disappear in some sort of alien apocalypse. So Visionary Somatics, keep an eye out for Dr. Tierney's new book. Any other places you'd like to point listeners to learn more about your work and what you're up to?
The Somatic Doctor is my brand. So my Instagram is #the Somatic Doctor. You can sign up for the newsletter there. I got some educational stuff about archetypes in the pipeline. And so I'm just going to step up to the next level as I approach the publication date, which is, as you said, unknown. But buckle up. It's a badass book. Really excited about it.
Well, I can't wait to read it. When it comes out, I would love to get a copy. Yeah. And it sounds like you'll be down here fairly soon as well. So maybe we can get lunch together while you're in town for this dissection. But I had a great time on the podcast today, and yeah, I appreciate you joining us and being a good sport for the conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks, Paul. Talk to you next time.
Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.